So Dead Rising has movies?
And in 3, 2, 1.
See, recently I've kind of developed a small hyper fixation on the Dead Rising series because all of the games were super cheap and I got all of them on Steam. Well, all the ones that are on Steam. I don't think I can get Case West or Case Zero, but that's neither here nor there. Dead Rising was a series I always wanted to get into and just never did because at the time I didn't have the hardware to play the games on, and by the time I did, I had pretty much forgotten about the series. However, I did see Game Informer articles. Specifically, I remember the Game Informer article for Dead Rising 2 that was showcasing all of the combo weapon concepts, and I thought it looked super cool and always wanted to play it. And just never did. I'm also making this video right now because it's kind of a lot faster to put out a movie review than it is to go and do all of the work for the deep dives, just like the one I'm working on. So we're just going to get this out here now so we have something to put out. Now, since its release, Dead Rising has gone through quite a bit of changes, and not all of them have been well received. Specifically, much like Capcom's other zombie franchise, which many people are familiar with, Resident Evil, the game design for Dead Rising also started to change right around the time that Capcom was having money problems, and they were almost bankrupt, I believe, back in 2013. So they leaned more into the action style, since that is what was popular. But I believe the deep discussion for that and the way some of the games turned out for the deep dive video coming later down the road. However, there was something interesting that I found while digging around for some Dead Rising goodies, and that's that Dead Rising has movies. Not a stranger to video game adaptations in film, Capcom had 2 Dead Rising films produced. And oh boy, I wish I could say they were better than the Resident Evil movies, but that would just be outright lying, because at least the Resident Evil films were high-budget productions. And if that last sentence gives you any idea of where this video is heading, then you might be a little surprised to hear that I liked Dead Rising Watchtower better than the travesty that was the Resident Evil franchise. Well, not quality-wise, but concept-wise. There are plenty of things that we're going to look at over the course of these films, but before we do that, I'm just going to touch on the Resident Evil thing for just a second. That's not the focus of this video. First, I'm not saying that the Resident Evil movies were poorly made. They clearly were pretty good in terms of quality, but the writing in them was always what I found weak, and I couldn't give less of a shit about the main character in those films and how all of the Resident Evil characters just became supporting roles to Anderson's Mary Sue. That's where I had my biggest issue. Also, Wesker was really bad in those. But we're not here to talk about that. That horse has already been beaten to death many times over. So in relation to Dead Rising, I thought the first film, Watchtower, was a fun time. It was a fun watch, and it doesn't try to be more than what it is presented as. It can be B-movie horror action adventure for about an hour and 45 minutes. And for that, I do have to give it props for not overstepping. So what exactly is Watchtower? Well, Dead Rising Watchtower is set between the events of Dead Rising 2 and 3, taking place in the fictional town of East Mission, Oregon, as a zombie outbreak occurs and the city is placed under quarantine. We follow online reporter Chase Carter and a few other survivors as they must try and escape the city before the military commences with a firebombing operation to clear the outbreak. You know, in true Dead Rising fashion. Joining Chase is Crystal, a woman who is infected with the virus and is taking Zombrex, a drug that keeps the virus dormant if taken on a daily basis. Jordan, Chase's camera woman who manages to escape the city just as the gates are closing in the quarantine zone. And Maggie, a civilian grieving the death of her daughter, who Chase and Crystal stumble upon after the outbreak happens. The entire cast here is original, but there is the appearance of Frank West in a cameo sense, as Frank West appears as a guest on a news network offering his own personal brand of insights and advice for those trying to survive a zombie outbreak. So, how does Dead Rising Watchtower stack up in the land of video game movie adaptations? To answer that, let's go ahead and take a look at all of my notes and my opinions that I took while watching the movie, and we will see if we can get to the bottom of that. First, I want to talk about the good aspects of the movie. Start on a high note and then we'll work our way down. Watchtower does a few things decently well, one of which is the film's depiction of the survivors' resourcefulness and the franchise's staple that would become combo weapons from 2 on. All of the combo weapons we see throughout the film are pretty much straight out of the games, with the exception, I think, of the trash can lid shield spinny blade thingy. I don't remember that being a thing in any of the games, at the very least. I am finishing my run of 4 right now, so I don't think I'm going to miss it if it doesn't show up in the next 2 chapters. But likewise, the action scenes do pay homage to how certain weapons get used in the games, like in the scene where Chase picks up a traffic cone and just plops it over the head of a zombie to get away from it during one of the action sequences. The weapons are fun and somewhat sensible compared to some of the more outlandish examples you'd find later on in the series, which was fun to watch in this film. There are also some quick little Easter eggs if you look for them hidden throughout the film, such as the illegals spray tag for safe house showing up on a building that the group runs into at one point, or the small Golden Frank statue that Chase finds while scavenging. A zombie you can see wearing a jacket that looks very much like the jacket Chuck Green is known for wearing. And also, there is a point where I see what I think is Dead Rising 3 being played on a TV in the background, which all of that's fun to see, just for little nods. Another aspect that I really enjoyed was the Frank cameos that served as breaks between plot points and Rob Riggle's portrayal of Frank. I know that's a divisive issue. I think it works in this movie, but it was just a fun little thing just to see. It added a level of humor between the scenes, and it showed Frank riding high after the success of his memoir on the Willamette outbreak, while also just painting him as this sleazy guy who will really just say anything. Finally, I thought that the government plotline within the movie was woven in pretty well, and if someone isn't familiar with Dead Rising, then they might be subverted by General Lyons's portrayal and the Phenotrans storyline. Also, the movie didn't really have the military general or the mercenary or something be like the final boss of the film, which was kind of nice, and it was also a way that you can see they were kind of setting things up for a sequel plot. But that's kind of about as far as I will commend it, because while the movie did have its strengths, which was in some of the more fun aspects, there were several other aspects of the film that either just met at the bar or completely slid right under. The zombie makeup, for example, being one of those aspects. Now, it's not the worst that I've seen in some movies, but the zombies in this film just feel way too clean to me. And I guess you could argue that the outbreak is just starting, so they're not all torn up and uglified and so on and so forth. You could probably make that argument, but it's a zombie movie. You kind of expect to see zombies be dirty and disgusting and chunks missing. Now, I'm not saying that the movie has to have any of those things, but it does come off as a little cheap that every zombie you see, and a lot of them are recycled. It makes it just come across a little cheap. Another middling aspect of the film that I do want to go over is the lead role. Chase kind of fills the role of Frank in this film as a reporter who gets stuck in an outbreak, but without any of the charm or the charisma that Frank West has. And by this, I mean Chase really wants the scoop. But then he feels bad about it. And then he really wants the scoop. And then he feels bad about it. And then he really wants it. And then he feels bad. And it's just it's that on repeat. And it's grating to a degree. Because when he's not talking about the scoop or the story, he's okay as a character, but he doesn't. Chase is like the weakest part. Like the reporter part of Chase is the weakest part of his character. And that's what it is. Another one being the character of Maggie. Maggie starts off well. A mother, she lost her daughter in the streets. I'm pretty sure she kills her daughter when she starts to turn into a zombie, but it doesn't I'm pretty sure that is. I've watched it once. I haven't gone back since watching it the first time, but I'm pretty sure she killed her daughter when she was starting to turn. And she's in this traumatic state of having to try and deal with that while survival's on the table. And she's a really nice character. She treats the other two survivors well. But something's sliding away up here. And you can see it as the movie progresses. And I think they do that pretty well. There's a couple of moments where you're like, okay, we know Maggie's not all there. But there's a thing that happens later in the film that I don't have an answer to. And I'm a little confused on. So, as we've already stated, the movie does a pretty decent job of showing her mental decline after dealing with her daughter's death in the outbreak. But towards the end of the film, there's a part where they go into a warehouse at a very distant part of the city, I'm imagining. It's hard to tell where exactly they go because a lot of it's... We'll get to that. That's another point. But they go to this warehouse, and the group splits up for a bit. Chase and Crystal go one way, Maggie goes off in another, and she kind of just wanders into this room that she unlocks because it's boarded off. And when she goes into the room, she sees her daughter as a zombie, but she's in a completely different attire and has been locked in this room. So who's out here playing my dress up zombie? And how did she get to the same place that Maggie was? It's a large coincidence. I'm gonna leave it there, but it felt off. It felt odd. Anyway, she's in this trance state where she's being apologetic about her daughter's death to her zombie kid, or maybe it's a kid that looks like her kid and she's just in a state. I don't know. Anyway, she's in this state, and then she just lets her eat her. She lets her eat. She lets the daughter zombie eat her because she feels bad about, and she's in this state. Her brain's gone. Okay, she dies. She gets eaten. She's dead. A lot of zombies in this room. The door's wide open. The rest of the warehouse gets flooded by zombies now. That part of the Maggie storyline, don't get it. I might have missed something. I don't know how her daughter wound up in that spot. Anyways, moving on. Now, just another quick little thing. Not too much. It doesn't really hit any of the bars, really. It was just kind of more fun than anything. It was kind of fun to see a familiar face in this film, because a lot of the actors are not... they're not high on the list here for actors. But yeah, it was fun to see the familiar face in this film in Harley Morenstein, who only has a couple of lines and dies a lackluster death. But it was really fun to see him play one of the Raiders. I'll just leave that one where it is. However, this is kind of where things stopped at least hitting the bar. And now we're watching the ones that completely missed it on the bottom. So starting off, one of the biggest things about a horror film, or just a film in general, if you're going to use them, are special effects. If your special effects aren't convincing, if they're not well done, it takes the audience out of the narrative, because they're going to focus on the poor execution over what your goal is. And you don't have to spend an arm and a leg on special effects to make them good. And I will die on this hill, practical effects that are less expensive majority of the time, and I could be completely baseless on this, but that are cheaper than CG graphics, a lot of the times that looks better than the CG graphics. And you can achieve a lot of effects with very cheap materials. But everybody now wants to use CG because it's becoming more accessible, and it is. But we'll get there in a second. Because this film, the special effects are subpar at best. Often in the action sequences, there are gibs or blows that would result in a blood spray or a gore explosion, for instance. And the film utilizes what I like to call the Sci-Fi Channel Library of Blood. And if you are unfamiliar with what I mean by that, the Sci-Fi Channel had a notorious streak, and I don't even know if it still exists or not, but it had a notorious streak where it put out very low quality, low budget B movies, and a lot of them were just very poorly made, and they all shared a lot of the same effects. So, there it is. Now, to be more specific, this Sci-Fi Channel of Blood Effects library, this is when low quality CGI blood sprays and gib effects are used that can break the immersion of the audience if the prop department doesn't take into account how these effects would affect the actual environment. So if you use CG blood and you don't render it to actually composite onto the scene, or you don't have the prop department come in, do a quick paint job and shoot the next shot, it's not going to look believable because there's no residue from that effect. Is essentially what I'm getting at in a lot of words that I could have shortened, but here we are. So moving on from special effects, and well, kind of. There's an instance of it in this that I'll get at. But moving on from special effects for the majority of it, the town or the city of East Mission just feels empty. It feels very empty throughout the entirety of this film. There are no chaotic hordes wandering the streets of East Mission, Oregon. And instead, when the film does decide to use drone shots to show travel scenes or sequences, they do more harm to this movie than they do good. There's supposed to be a large zombie outbreak going on. It's getting out of control. The military is coming in to firebomb the place and just level it to set it back to zero. But when they show the drone shots over East Mission, there's nothing going on. The streets are empty. There's no fires or smoke or any kind of survivors running around and is trying to get through hordes. The streets of East Mission, Oregon are just vacant. Which makes me, as an audience member, it makes me go, this doesn't look that bad. Why are they calling the military in? It just kind of takes you out of the whole scope of the movie. But along with just the general lack of zombies, as I said, you also don't see other survivors very much. And a big thing with the Dead Rising franchise is the survivors. Like a lot of the side missions that you go, you interact with, you save them, and you drag them back to the safe house, and you can feel good about saving these other people that are stuck in precarious situations. In Watchtower, you don't see many other survivors either. Like, outside of maybe 2 instances of some extras running away or getting offed almost as soon as they appear on screen, I can count, I think, maybe 2 sequences of the film where you see other survivors. And in the first sequence, it's when they're running towards the quarantine zone near the start. And then the second time is when 2 survivors try to get help from the raider party, and then they die. And that's it. So lack of survivors in a Dead Rising film is just another big strike on my books. You could have some fun scenes with them, even if they're just brief exchanges. You could have some fun scenes, but they don't. However, moving on, there are two final low mark qualities that I want to cover for this. The first being that we don't really get the equivalence of a psycho anywhere in this film. And if you are coming into this and not familiar with how Dead Rising works, psychos are basically bosses in the video game, and their whole premise is that after the outbreak or the incident where all the zombies come in happens, they spiral out of control and their brain just takes a plummet into the realm of insanity, and they latch onto something and they become this caricature of a person that is extremely devolved. And Dead Rising is known for some of its psychos. Like the very one of my favorite video game bosses for the hilarity of it is in Dead Rising 1. And it's the supermarket in Dead Rising 1. I'm not going to post a clip here because it'll be in the other video, but if you've played Dead Rising, you know who I'm talking about. We don't really get that in this film. We have something that is closer to how the maniacs are being presented to me in Dead Rising 4, where they're very low efforts and they're not very entertaining at best. But we do have one of those kind of people as the main villain of this movie, being, I think his name is Logan. I think they did name him, but the biker gang leader, Logan. He gets one scene where he tries to be that kind of character, but it doesn't work that well, nor is it like Logan's portrayal is very static, it's very stoic, and he doesn't change a whole lot. There's no over-the-topness to his character. He's just a guy that sees benefit in the outbreak because he doesn't have to go work a 9-to-5. That is his entire shtick. He can either stay and be the king in a zombie world, or he can go back to his office job, and that's his whole character. Between that is just some very flat acting for this type of character. And that's where that's at. The second issue, or the second point that isn't ever brought up in this film, isn't included, is that there are no talks of the bees, the wasps, the hornets, the horn wasps. There's no talks of the bees. For those of you not familiar with Dead Rising, in Dead Rising, it was a genetically altered wasp, I believe, or a bee. It was one of them. One of the things was stingers that carried a parasitic virus that infected cattle and then people, and then outbreaks happened, and it all stems from the parasitic virus of these bees. There's no talks, and the bees are always a focal point in the games, except 4. I don't remember finding any in 4. I could be wrong about that. I'm not really paying attention to 4. 4 is I'm just kind of trudging through the last of it, but they're always a focal point in the games at some point, whether it's about the government plot, if it's the Phenotrans plot, if it's the human survivors finding out about them. They're always big into the storyline, and they are not present in this movie at all. Not even a reference. So you're kind of left into this story from the perspective of the film that the outbreak is just occurring because of faulty drugs. Which, I mean, based on where the storyline takes place, this is after Zombrex already exists. And, if the government's tampering with the Zombrex, then sure. But the bees were always a really fun little story point, and they aren't shown in this film, and it would have been nice to see it. That's all I'm saying. So, with all of that taken into account, where do I rate Dead Rising Watchtower? Well, I think it is a fun homage to the series, but it is still the equivalence of a Sci-Fi Channel production, and just for reference, because I haven't stated it yet, the Dead Rising films are Crackle originals, which has the same air of Sci-Fi Channel in my brain. But there were fun parts about the movie. And like I said, the fun parts of the movie, they're a good time. And the low points are kind of just sacrifices that are made to the B movie gods of low budget constraints. So, with that all said and done, I give Dead Rising Watchtower 3 out of 5 scoops. 3 out of 5 scoops for its attempt. Now, some of you may have already looked at the runtime of this video and are probably thinking, "But didn't Benny say he was going to be reviewing both films?" And you would be correct. But if you watch through all of the Watchtower review and said, "Hey, I will go and I will watch Watchtower. Thanks, Benny," then I am begging you to not watch Dead Rising Endgame. Endgame is the sequel to Dead Rising Watchtower, but where Watchtower had charm and some passion put into its creation, Endgame has none of those qualities and burns any of the goodwill and faith that Watchtower garnered in the first place. Endgame is just not good. It barely even feels like a zombie flick at times when you're watching it, and all of the fun nods and references that Watchtower made to the games that made it enjoyable at times, it does none of that. So I will outline the issues that I have with Endgame here, and most of it just comes from the writing. First of all of the plots that are set up in Watchtower that were made to go into a sequel format, they either get left wide open, or the few that do conclude in very anticlimactic ways. The only returning cast to Endgame are both Chase and Jordan, but I'm not going to even bother describing the special part of that. Jordan really only shows up in the last 20 minutes of the movie. So there's that as well, I guess. But with those two returning, a lot of their personalities are just gone from the character. There's also there's in every one of these kind of movies, there's always a MacGuffin that you have to chase, and that's one of the end goal. But there's like 3 different end goals of this film. So there is the MacGuffin that the group is chasing alongside its main plot point, but it ultimately just runs into a dead end and feels like a lot of wasted effort and time because of it. The dialogue of the film is bad, and look, okay, time out. Look, I know I cuss like a sailor at times when I get heated up. I really have to like censor myself in a lot of situations, especially like in a video format, because fuck becomes a comma in my vocabulary if I go far enough into it. So I'm not opposed to cussing or language or any kind of things like that. But this movie is just a slew of swears and a mound of unmeaningful dialogue about every 5 seconds. And it just gets old and makes the characters tiring. So overall, Endgame tries to take itself too seriously, which is where I think its main problems lie. And because of that, and what I mean by that is that it jumps the genre from campy horror movie based on a fun campy horror action game to a kind of crime thriller that feels like you were watching an episode of NCIS, but instead of Gibbs and Tony dealing with terrorists, you get zombies in a secret lab for like the last half hour of the film. Also, where in the first one we did get the cameo character of Frank West, and it was kind of a kind of entertaining way to bring him into the movie. We do get that in Dead Rising Endgame. However, the cameo character in Endgame is Chuck Green, but he shows up for literally less than a minute, says about 1 line that doesn't mean anything in the context to the rest of the film or any to the characters, and I didn't even realize it was him until I watched the credits roll, and his name shows up under the cast list. So, Dead Rising Endgame, 0 out of 5 scoops for bad writing, 0 payoff in plot, and just overall all around bad acting just throughout the entire thing. So there you go. Don't watch Dead Rising Endgame, but do give Watchtower a try. Watchtower is a fun time. Endgame, no. Just avoid that one at all costs. So, anyways, that's all I got for today. So, do the like and the subscribe thing. The full Dead Rising series review retrospective thing something video is coming soon after I finish up. Oh, I just gotta finish up 4. And work should start on that. But cool. Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye. See you later. Love you. Goodbye. Have fun. Bye. I'll take a pause for a minute. Almost forgot I had pizza bagels in the oven when we almost had an incident.